Deseret Book Audio Library presents Brad Wilcox and a talk entitled Filling Your Testimony Tank. This talk was recorded in front of a live audience. And now, Brad Wilcox and Filling Your Testimony Tank.
Brothers and sisters, as you think about the problems facing young people today, whether those problems are violence, immorality, drinking, drugs, we could continue to list problems by the hundreds. But those aren't really the problems. Those are symptoms of deeper problems. And one of those deeper problems is weak spirituality and weak testimony. And that's why tonight I want to focus some of my thoughts on testimony. I'd like to begin by sharing a letter that came to me from a young man. He says, "Dear Brother Wilcox, I'm trying to prepare for my mission, but I have found myself doubting, questioning, and worrying. I don't even know exactly what I am feeling. It's like there is this huge black hole in my heart. I don't know what's wrong and I'm scared. Everything I hold dear is slipping through my fingers, and everything I used to know for sure, I don't know anymore. Where did my testimony go? Or did I just never have one in the first place?" Now, if you, at one time or other, have ever felt like this young man, tonight I direct my comments to you. Tonight I would like to tell you some of the things that I tried to tell him. I had a mother come to me one time, and she said, "May I talk to you about my son? I'm so worried." I said, "Yeah, what seems to be the problem?" And she said, "Well, he's lost his testimony. He used to have one, but now he's lost it. I know he had one, but now it's gone. What can I do?" I think one of the first things that we can all do is to stop referring to testimonies in light switch terminology. You have one, you don't have one. It's on, it's off. You got it, oh, lost it again. Oh, found it, found my nope, it's gone, lost it again. And we talk about testimonies as if it's a light that's on or off. And in reality, a much better analogy might be to talk about a gas tank. Now, it doesn't sound too spiritual, but it's a much better analogy because besides a point at which you can be completely empty, total faithlessness, and a point at which you can be completely full, having what the Book of Mormon refers to as a perfect knowledge, there are also a lot of different levels at which our testimonies might be at any given time in our lives. And so instead of talking about testimonies as being something you have or something that you don't have, let's talk instead about levels of testimony through which we must all pass as we make our way toward that full tank. In each gas tank, there are three markings. There's the quarter tank mark, there's the half tank mark, and there's the three-quarter tank mark. Tonight, each one of those marks is going to represent a different level of testimony that we obtain. The quarter tank mark is going to stand for a testimony of experience. The half tank mark is going to stand for a testimony of study. And the three-quarter tank mark is going to represent a testimony of revelation. Let's talk about each level. Number one, a testimony of experience. This is the kind of testimony that many of us have as we grow up in the church and we go to primary and we experience all the positive things that there are in the church. We go to young men's and young women's and we go to seminary and we experience the church. In the scriptures in John 7:17, Jesus said, "If any man will do his will, then he will know of the doctrine." If any of us will do church, then we can know whether it's true. Well, that's good news for those of us who do church. Because brothers and sisters, if there's anything you do in your life, it is church. You are constantly doing church. And that means that already many of you are sitting at that quarter tank mark and you do not even realize the testimony that you're sitting on top of. You don't even give yourself credit for the testimony that you have. Because when it comes to your experiences in the church, Many of you are already expert witnesses of. I met a young man who came to Education Week one year. He was a foreign exchange student from England. And although he had lived with a Mormon family, he had not participated with anything that was LDS because they were under strict instructions not to try to teach this young man about religion while he was here on this exchange program. Well, right before he went home, he invited himself to come to Education Week with the family, and I had the chance to meet him there. Well, I was impressed with this boy, and after we visited for just a minute, I said, "Are you going to go to the dance on Thursday night?" He said, "Dance?" So I thought Mormons didn't dance. I said, "Who told you that?" He said, "Oh, my friends, all my friends in England, they said Mormons don't dance." I said, "Just go Thursday. Just go. You'll see for yourself. Just go on Thursday." On Friday, he came back. His eyes were this big. He says, "Oh man, can Mormons dance?" He says, "That was the best dance I've ever been to." He said, "I've never seen people dance like that." I said, "And you'll never see people who can dance like that on Thursday night and remember it on Friday morning." I said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh, this is great." He says, "I know Mormons dance." Now catch the words. I know Mormons dance. He didn't say, "I believe Mormons dance." He didn't say, "I hope Mormons dance." He said, "I know Mormons dance." He knew through his own experience. He said, "I can't wait to go back to England and tell all my friends who told me that Mormons don't dance." He said, "I can't wait to go and tell them that yes, Mormons dance is the best dance I've ever been to." Now that young man was leaving Education Week with a certain level of testimony. Did he have a full tank of gas? No, but he did have a testimony based on his experience. And we all gain similar testimonies as we have positive experiences in the church. I met another young man when I was down in Texas, and Sister Barbara Jones and I were attending a conference together. He was a Hispanic boy who had just gotten baptized a few weeks earlier. Barbara and I were both interested in hearing a little bit about his conversion. So Sister Jones said, "What was the first thing you noticed about the church?" And he said, "You guys have basketball hoops right in the middle of your church." I said, "Yeah, we do. We pray to the hoops. We decorate them for parties." I said, "Yeah, we've got basketball hoops right in the center of the church." And I guess that's probably a little different than some of the other churches that he'd been in. But he said, "No, that's not the first thing I noticed." He said, "The first thing I noticed was the feeling I had when I walked through the doors." I said, "Oh, you mean when you walked in the chapel?" He said, "No. When I walked through the glass doors, I knew this place was different. I knew this wasn't an ordinary meeting house. I knew this wasn't just another building. I knew there was something unique about this building." All he had done was walk through the front door, and already he had a testimony of experience. He had a testimony that said, yes, there is something different about this place. And that's the kind of testimony that many of you carry with you right now. Based on your own experiences in the church, you can say, "I know." When little children stand up to bear their testimonies, they're not bearing a false testimony. They're not bearing an immature testimony. When they stand up in testimony meeting and say, "I know the church is true," they are bearing a very legitimate testimony, and they are not misusing that word at all. For based on their experiences, they do indeed know. Even President Heber J. Grant, who spoke in General Conference, said, "I bear testimony from my experience." I met another young man who's from the Northwest. He was invited to represent his school in a big all-state choir, band, and orchestra. And he went to this big city, and they were all in hotel rooms, and he ended up in a room with some young men from other places across the state, and he didn't know these young men very well. Well, one night they began to talk, as young men sometimes do. Well, this boy, who had just joined the church a few weeks earlier, decided that he did not like the way the conversation was going. He didn't want to hear what they were talking about. So he rolled over in his bed, and he kind of put his pillow over his head, and he pretended to be asleep. But he wasn't asleep. He heard these boys describe in great detail the shoplifting they were involved with, the drugs that they were taking, and that one of them was selling at an elementary school. He listened as they talked about the young women they had defiled in great detail. And then finally, one of these boys reaches over, takes his pillow, and hits this kid. The kid sits up, and he says, "Hey, someone told me you just joined the Mormon church." The kid says, "Yeah, so what of it?" The kid says, "Well, you're going to hell. My minister says you're going to hell." Now, this kid comes to me later, and he says, "Brother Wilcox, I don't know a lot about the church. I don't know a lot about the doctrine, and I have to admit to you, I never even read the whole Book of Mormon before I got baptized." But he says, I know there is no way that they can sit there and talk about shoplifting and selling drugs to children and raping young women and then tell me that I am going to hell for joining a church. He says, that just didn't make sense. I said, you're right, it didn't make sense. He had a testimony of experience, and that testimony of experience was enough to see him through. Young people, do you realize that just because you are here tonight, you know more about what happens in the Mormon church than many people who write books and make movies on the subject? Just because you are here tonight, just because you're an active member, do you realize that you are more of an expert about the Mormon church than many people who are asked questions about our faith on national television? Yes, you have testimonies of experience. And so before you sit around and say, no, I don't have a testimony, I want you to realize that most of you are sitting on a quarter tank. You guys can all stand up in testimony meeting and say, I've got gas. Don't you dare do that. But you guys, you've got gas in the tank, and you've got to recognize that it's there. In 1830, Lorenzo Snow, who later became a prophet, was a student at Oberlin College. He was disillusioned with religion and with traditional Christianity. He went to visit his sister, Eliza R. Snow, a member of the church who was living in Kirtland, Ohio. When he arrived there, he attended a small meeting where patriarchal blessings were being given by the prophet's father, Joseph Smith Sr. When he attended the meeting, he listened, first incredulously, then openly, and finally he left the meeting very much inspired. This future prophet had gained his first level of testimony. He knew from his experience that despite the world religions with which he was dissatisfied, despite traditional Christianity with which he was dissatisfied, he had finally found something that had left him inspired. He had an experience, much like the experiences that many of you have. And he had gas in the tank. He had started to fill the tank. He had started to get to that quarter tank mark. And that's where many of you are. Now, brothers and sisters, you know that you can't get very far on a quarter tank of gas. It's important to keep filling the tank. You got to keep going. Let's talk about that next level of testimony, the half tank mark. That's the testimony of study. This is the testimony that many converts bring to the church as they learn about the gospel and as they start seeing puzzle pieces fit together, as they start hearing answers to questions that they've had all their lives, as they start hearing explanations for things that their former ministers had told them were mysteries of God. They start seeing it coming together and they get so excited because they have a testimony of study. This is the same kind of testimony that young people gain as they get involved with seminary and they start figuring some things out for themselves. Listen closely to what one young man in Laramie, Wyoming told me. He said, "I've always heard people talk about the Book of Mormon and quote from it. And I've read parts for Sunday school, but it wasn't until I really started to read it straight through in seminary that I began to understand what was going on and how deep it is. There is so much there that I had just overlooked. When I used the cross references with the Bible, I saw for myself how the books go hand in hand and how either one without the other is incomplete. The more I read, the more convinced I was that the book could never have been written by one young man alone, especially not Joseph Smith, who was a young man with very little formal education." Now that statement right there comes from a boy who's filling the tank. He's not just settling for going to a fireside or attending a church meeting. Instead, he is starting to study and learn on his own. Elder John Widsoe, an early apostle, said, "It is a paradox that some will gladly devote time every day for many years to learn a science or an art, yet will expect to win a knowledge of the gospel which comprehends all sciences and arts through perfunctory glances at books or occasional listening to sermons. The gospel should be studied more intensively than any school or college subject." Think about what that apostle is saying. It's time to focus as much on your gospel study as you do on your AP classes. Believe me, the credit that you are getting for your gospel study is credit that goes far beyond college credit. It is a credit that will fill that testimony tank. When I was in Chile on my mission, I served in a little town called Los Andes. One day my companion and I were walking down the road and this lady leaned outside of her window, shook a blanket out on the side of her house, and she said, "Buenos dias, elders." She said, "Good morning, elders." And then she stuck her head back inside her house. I looked at my companion and I said, "Did you hear what she just called us?" And he said, "Yeah." And I went over and I banged on the door and she opened the door and I said, "How did you know my name? How did you know my first name?" I said, "How did you know I was an elder?" She said, "Oh, well, I read it on your tag." I said, "You did not. I was clear across the street. How did you know I was an elder?" She said, "Oh, okay, come in." So my companion and I went in the house and we heard the story about how this lady and her husband had been among the very first baptisms in that city when it was first opened to missionary work 20 years earlier. They loved the missionaries, they loved the church, they loved the meetings, they loved their little circle of friends that they had found in the Mormon church. And then something happened. Suddenly the experiences they were having were not all positive. Suddenly somebody ran over their cat or something, I don't know. Somebody did something that offended them and they ended up getting discouraged because the experiences suddenly weren't positive anymore. They ended up leaving the church. She said, "And now we've attended another church for almost 20 years and we know that the Mormon church isn't true." I said, "Oh, you know that?" She says, "Yes, we know it." I said, "Well, how do you know that?" And she said, "Well, we read it in a book." I said, "Oh, really? And do you have the book still?" She says, "Yeah." She goes in the other room. She brings me back a book about this thick that says something about everything you ever wanted to know about the Mormons. Now, I think it's interesting that people who write books called Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About the Mormons are very rarely Mormons. She said, "We read that book and then we found out that the church wasn't true." Well, my companion started to visit with her and talk to her and ask her some questions, and I started thumbing through this book. Now, the book was in Spanish, and I didn't have a chance to read very much, but I thumbed through a few pages, and you guys, I do not pretend to be a church scholar. I do not pretend for 1 minute to be an expert on church history. But I know that Joseph Smith did not see two angels named Urim and Thummim. I know that. I know that. I said, look, some of the things you're reading in this book aren't quite accurate. Some of the things you're reading in this book aren't quite true. You want to know what Mormons believe? Then come, study with us. Don't just come to the parties. Don't just come and attend with your friends. Don't just make it a social event. Come and study with us. She took that challenge, and she and her husband and their children came, and they started studying, and they started learning, and they came back to church. And I'll never forget when this sister stood at a makeshift homemade pulpit that was basically a box that was turned on its side in the little house where we were meeting, not a chapel, but a little house where we were meeting with one light bulb hanging down from the ceiling. And I'll never forget when she stood at that little pulpit without even a microphone to amplify her voice. And she said, I know that this is the true church. I know that Joseph Smith was a true prophet. I know that the Book of Mormon is true. And as she bore her testimony, not just a testimony of experience, but a testimony of study, there were not many in that room who didn't believe that she finally, truly did know. Brothers and sisters, it's up to us to keep filling that testimony tank. Listen to what President Howard W. Hunter once wrote. Although I had attended church classes most of my life, how many can relate to that? Hey, how many have attended church classes most of your life? How many have done the church thing? Yeah. All right. Although I had attended church classes most of my life, my first real awakening to the gospel came in a Sunday school class in Adams Ward taught by Brother Peter A. Clayton. He had a wealth of knowledge and the ability to inspire young people. I studied the lessons, read the outside assignments he gave us. Now, excuse me? Studied a Sunday school lesson? Excuse me? Did we hear that right? I studied the lessons, read the outside assignments. You mean those little scripture references that the teacher puts up on the board? You mean you're actually supposed to read those? I thought they were just practicing their handwriting. He says, I studied the lessons, read the outside assignments he gave us, and participated in speaking on assigned subjects. I suddenly became aware of the real meaning of some of the gospel principles, an understanding of the degrees of glory and the requirements of celestial exaltation as Brother Clayton taught and instructed us. I think of this period of my life as the time the truths of the gospel commenced to unfold. I always had a testimony of the gospel, but suddenly I commenced to understand. See, he had had a testimony of the gospel, a testimony of experience, but finally, through his efforts to study, he was beginning to understand the gospel. He was reaching that half-tank point that all of us must reach. But brothers and sisters, you know as well as I do that there are people who know a great deal about the gospel, but they're not active in the church. You probably know people as I do who read every church book that comes out. They're like incredible experts on gospel doctrine, and yet they're not active. So you realize as well as I do that half a tank of gas is not going to be enough to get us where we need to go. How many of you remember the story of the three little pigs? Yeah, the three little pigs. The first pig built his house of? Straw. Good, you do know the story. The second pig built his house of? Mud? Is that what I heard? No, the second pig built his house of sticks. And the third pig built his house of bricks. As we are building testimonies for ourselves, we need to realize that the straw of experience and the sticks of gospel study will never be enough when the big bad wolf comes. When the big bad wolf comes to blow your house in, you are going to have a testimony built of bricks. The bricks of personal revelation. But I want to remind you, the house of straw was indeed a house. And the house of sticks was a house. Your testimony of experience and your testimony of study are testimonies. You have every right to stand up and bear that testimony. But Elder Boyd K. Packer has said the following: no one of us can survive in the world of today, much less in what it soon will become, without personal inspiration. Brothers and sisters, we've got to keep filling the tank. We've got to get to that 3/4 tank mark, a testimony of personal revelation. Listen to how one young woman describes that. She says, in the scriptures it says, ask and it shall be given you. But I didn't know how literally I could take that. Now I have asked, and the answer was given to me. I have come to know through the Spirit that God really is there and that the church is true. It wasn't anything dramatic or big. It was more like a good feeling. Lots of good feelings put together. Like all the Christmases you remember rolled into one. It felt warm. I knew I was in the right place. What a beautiful explanation of how the Spirit touched her. And when that Spirit touches your spirit, then you have something that is permanent. It was President Joseph Fielding Smith who said, when a man has the manifestation from the Holy Ghost, it leaves an indelible impression on his soul, one that is not easily erased. It is spirit speaking to spirit, and it comes with convincing force. A manifestation of an angel or even the Son of God himself would impress the eye and mind and eventually become dimmed. But the impressions of the Holy Ghost sink deeper into the soul and are more difficult to erase. When the Spirit speaks to your spirit, then you have gained a testimony of personal revelation. One of my heroes, Brother George Durant, speaks about a time when he was called on his first mission. How excited he was when the bishop extended the call, and how he went to the place where he was working, a gas station, and he talked to the gas station owner and told him about his call. And the gas station owner, who was an inactive member of the church, said, all right, just make me one promise. Don't stand up at the pulpit and say, I know the church is true. Because you can't know that. Brother Durant says, I could not tell him at the time that I knew the church was true, but I did tell him that I thought it was. Then Brother Durant went on his mission. And through the course of his mission, he gained the experiences, the study, and the personal revelation that he needed. Listen to what he describes. He says, the first weeks were difficult and I had been homesick and heartsick, but at the same time I had an intense desire to be a good missionary. I had been assigned to tell the Joseph Smith story to the other 7 missionaries in the whole district. I stood up to recite that which I had diligently and prayerfully prepared and planted within my heart. At first my message was just words, but then something happened. I felt a swelling within my soul which filled me with such joy I could scarcely speak. In my heart, I could see the sacred grove, and I could see Joseph Smith, and I could see that he could see God the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. Then I knew it was good and was true. I didn't think anymore that the church was true. I knew when I returned from my mission, I said in the presence of my former boss that I knew the church was true. Now I'm sure his former boss rolled his eyes and thought, oh, another one standing up there saying, I know, when you can't say that. But brothers and sisters, he could say that. He could say it because of his experience. He could say it because of his study. And he could say it because of how the Spirit touched his spirit. He gained a testimony of personal revelation. President Boyd K. Packer left his home with only a high school education and a belief, not a certainty, that the teachings of the church were true. He went into the military, and during the course of time that he was training to be a pilot, He had many good experiences in the church. He read the Book of Mormon and he pled with God for an answer that seemed very slow in coming. He continued to participate with the other members of the church. He continued his study. During the long months of intensive training that it took to become a good pilot, Elder Packer fed his spiritual hunger with daily study and prayer. He had kept himself clean, and he had used every opportunity to join with other members of the church to partake of the sacrament and to participate in the services. His personal preparation and meeting with the other members had deepened his belief in gospel teachings. What he yet lacked was confirmation, sure knowledge of that which he had already come to feel was true. One night, President Packer could not sleep. He says he was unsettled in spirit. He says, "I thought that I had no testimony to anchor me. I desperately wanted to know. I struggled with doubt and uncertainty. I wanted a testimony. During the night, I left my bed and went some distance to a secluded area where a makeshift bunker had been built. It was a clear night. After some moments, I determined to really ask for some consolation, some indication to strengthen me. I wanted a testimony. I had studied the scriptures. We had tried to teach one another. I had tried to perfect myself according to the meager knowledge I had. I felt a compelling inward need for some spiritual consolation. Then I knelt to pray. Almost mid-sentence it happened. I could not describe to you what happened if I were determined to do so, and I am not. I knew it to be a very private, a very individual manifestation. At last I knew for a certainty. After some time I crawled from that bunker under a sky of brilliant stars. I walked or floated back to my bed and spent the rest of the night in a feeling of joy and awe." Young people, the quarter tank mark is the testimony of experience. The half tank mark is the testimony of study. But Elder Packer felt like he needed more, and he gained more. A testimony of personal revelation. One time, I was at one of the youth programs on BYU campus, and after the testimony meeting, I had gone back to the dorm, and there was a young man there from California, handsome young man, and he was crying. And my first thought was, oh no, man, which girl broke his heart? And I went up to the boy and I said, okay, what was her name? And he said, no, Brother Wilcox, it's not that at all. I said, well, then what's the matter? Why are you crying? And he said, I know. I have learned for myself. His words just fascinated me because he didn't even realize that he was saying the exact same words that were said by Joseph Smith himself. See, Joseph Smith had the first vision, but then he walked out of the grove. We never know what happens next because the movie ends. You know, he walks out of the grove, the movie ends, and we don't know what happened after that. But he went home, and he went into his house, and his mother noticed that something was wrong. He put his elbow up on the hearth of the fireplace, and his mother said, "What's wrong?" He replied, "Never mind, all is well. I am well enough off." He then said to his mother, "I have learned for myself." This boy at BYU campus had said the exact same thing that had been said by the prophet Joseph Smith. The boy from California had felt the witness of the Spirit. He was at the 3/4 tank mark. Joseph Smith also felt the Spirit, but beyond that, he had actually seen God in Jesus Christ. Joseph had become a special witness. His needle pointed to full. Yet even Joseph's powerful and world-changing testimony came by degrees. Before the grove, there was the groundwork. Before the pillar, there was the prayer. Before the revelation, there was the reading. Joseph's experience, his study, and his revelations of the Spirit, his witnesses of the Spirit had prepared the way and built the faith, humility, and obedience necessary for him to receive a perfect knowledge of God's existence. So, brothers and sisters, yes, there is a point at which the gas tank is empty, and yes, there is a point at which the gas tank is full. But there are also different levels along the way. Listen to a letter I received just the other day. This young lady writes, "When it comes to church, I'm not really sure. I go to all the meetings. I've gone to EFY. I go to girls' camp. I go to young women's and sacrament meeting. I read my scriptures. I have high standards and all that stuff. But I don't know if the church is really true. How can anyone know if the church is true? How can they know unless they've seen God?" My young friends, do you have to have a full tank of gas to get the car to the store? Do you have to have a full tank of gas to get the car out of your driveway? Do you have to have a full tank of gas to make the car worth driving? No. You take whatever gas you've got in that tank right now and you make that car go, and then fill the tank. Over and over and over. One car doesn't last forever on one tank of gas. You got to fill it up over and over and over again. And your leaders, they can stand at the gas station and they can put on the little clown suits and they can motion you in. They can hang the flags. They can offer you little prizes if you come in and fill the tank. You know, they can stand out there and say, "Hey, the gas is on special. Woo! Today." They can get all excited and they can motion you in, and they can even just stand there and plead with you to put the gas in the tank. But when it comes right down to it, the salvation station is strictly self-service. Without exception, each of us puts gas in his own tank, or should I say, puts oil in his own lamp. It's up to us to fill that tank. But while we're filling that tank, I just want to assure you that you probably have much more gas in that tank than you are giving yourself credit for. And if you leave here tonight with anything in your mind, I want you to leave here realizing that yes, you might not be on full, but you are not on empty either. One last story as we conclude. I told you at the beginning of a young man who felt like he had lost his testimony. His mother was worried because she said he used to have one, but now it's gone. I invited that young man to come with me to a fireside. The fireside was about an hour away, and so we had time to drive together in the car and talk. Now, you guys know God blessed me with a mouth. I mean, this thing goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. But for one of the few times in my life, I actually shut my mouth and I listened. For an entire hour, I listened to this young man as he talked about how he felt like he used to have a testimony, but how it was gone. How at one point he was so sure of the truth, but now he was filled with questions and doubts. I listened as he told me about the anti-Mormon literature that his friends had given him. He told me about some of the questions that his friends had asked him and some of the pressure that was being put on him to lower his standards. All of this just came pouring out of him. And I listened. I listened and listened and listened. And then we got to the fireside. And this boy sat right on the back row, and I stood up and I gave the fireside. Right at the end of the fireside, I did something that you dread. I said, "I brought a young friend with me tonight, and I'd like to ask him to come up here and bear his testimony." How many have ever had that happen to him? Yeah, how many have ever had the bishop say, "Okay, young brother so-and-so, would you please come up and bear..." How many have ever seen that happen? And you're just like, "Ah!" And you're about dying. I mean, the bishop stands up and says, "We'd like to hear testimony from some of our youth." And then all the priests sit up, and they got these big red marks on their heads where they've been sleeping on the bench in front of them. And all the laurels start looking at the door like, "Okay, can I get out of the door before the bishop can get off the stand and tackle me in the aisle?" And they all start planning their escape routes out of the chapel. I know how awkward that is when young people get put in that situation, and yet I did it. I did it to this boy. I said, I brought a friend with me tonight, and as we conclude this fireside, I'd like to ask him to come up and bear his testimony to you. Oh, you guys, that kid looked at me, I mean, man, it was like knives just came flying out of his eyes. He looked at me like, what are you talking about? I just spent an hour telling you I don't even have a testimony. And now you're saying, come up and bear your testimony. He looked at me. He looked at the door. He looked at me. He looked at the door. But I was his ride home. We were an hour away from his house, and I had the car keys. And so finally, hesitantly, he began to stand, and with all the teenagers turning around to look and see who it was, he started making his way to the front. The whole time, he was looking at me like, I am going to get you. I am going to kill you for this. He was walking up the aisle, and his eyes were just riveted on me. And he was like, what are you doing? I can't believe you do this. And he walked up, and I smiled really big, and I sat down, and he stood at the pulpit, and he went just like this. I know the church is true. I know that Jesus Christ lives and loves us. I know the Book of Mormon is true. I know there's a prophet on the earth today. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Then he sat down, and some lovely young woman got up and said the closing prayer and blessed the refreshments to nourish and strengthen our bodies. And then everybody got up, and they all started to head to the cultural hall where the refreshments were waiting, except for this boy who came over to me, and he got about this close to my face. And he said, what are you doing? I can't believe you did that. I can't believe I told you I didn't even have a testimony, and you made me get up and you bear my testimony. And I said, just calm down. I said, breathe, breathe, breathe. I said, now listen. I said, before you rip my legs out of their sockets, before you kill me, would you just answer one question? He says, what? And I said, do you know when you lie? And he said, you are so weird. You're the weirdest man I have ever met in my life. And I said, I know I'm weird. But listen to me. Just answer the question. Do you know when you lie? He said, of course I know when I lie. What does that have to do with anything? I said, if you steal something from the store and then you say, no, I didn't steal it, you know how that feels. He said, of course I know how that feels. I said, if you go home late and you say you had a flat tire, but you didn't really have a flat tire, but you say you had a flat tire, you know how that feels inside. He said, of course I know how that feels. I said, then what are you feeling right now? And he said, I don't feel it. He says, I know when I lie. I know how that feels. And I don't feel it. I don't feel it. He says, I do have a testimony, don't I? I do have a testimony. Oh, I just hugged him and hugged him and hugged him and hugged him. No, he's not on full, but he's not on empty either. He has much more testimony than he is giving himself credit for. And young people like him, many of you may not be on full, but you are not on empty either. You have much more testimony than you're giving yourselves credit for. You can stand and say the words, I know, because whether it is a level of experience, a level of study, or a level of personal revelation, you do know. Of all the things that I could tell you tonight, that's the thing that I wanted to tell you that was most important of all. I want to leave you with my testimony. I know that Jesus Christ lives. I know He loves us. I know He leads us. And I know He lifts us up. He did not come to put us down. He came to lift us up. I know we have a prophet on the earth today. I'm so grateful for him. I'm so grateful for his goodness. I'm so grateful for the life he leads, the private life as well as the public life. I am so grateful for his goodness and his strength and his special witness. I leave you my testimony that Joseph Smith was a prophet. The gospel is restored. Jesus Christ's atonement is real. I leave you with my testimony that God is there. He knows us, and He has a plan for our lives. This is a testimony that I have because of my own experience, because of my own study, and because of my own personal revelation. Brothers and sisters, I know when I lie. And I am not lying. I leave that witness with all of my love, with all of my friendship, with all of my support for you. God bless you, young people. I know there are so many problems out there. I know about immorality, and I know about violence, and I know about drugs, and I know about drinking, and I know about everything else that fills the lives of adolescents clear across the world. But I also know that with gas in your tank, you're going to make it through. You're going to make it through all of that. And I say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen.
This has been a production of the Deseret Book Audio Library.